Good morning. I'm Rashad Salamat.
And I'm Doug Krisner. Here are the stories we're following today.
The embattled developer Country Garden, it's warning that it may default after reporting a record first-half loss. Bloomberg's Bonnie Au has more.
The Chinese developer has reported a loss of almost $7 billion. Country Garden said it may go into default if financial performance deteriorates further. The warning highlights how China's deepening real estate crisis has battered one of its property giants. Country Garden acknowledged that it didn't adopt timely measures to deal with the slowdown. It also failed to recognize the risks of its heavy reliance on lower-tier property markets. Country Garden said it continues to negotiate with bond investors and banks to extend debt maturities to keep it afloat. In Hong Kong, I'm Bonnie Au, Bloomberg Daybreak Asia.
Later today in China, we'll get the official PMI numbers, and they probably will indicate a deterioration right across the board for the month of August. We have more from Bloomberg's Joanne Wong.
China's services PMI are expected to fall close to a level that would indicate shrinking activity. A post-pandemic surge in service activity had been the main prop to the recovery, but that appears to be running out of steam, and some help may be on the horizon. China's central bank is drafting preliminary policies to give private businesses better access to funding to boost economic growth. In Hong Kong, I'm Joanne Wong, Bloomberg Daybreak Asia.
Now, China is set to approve the first batch of generative artificial intelligence services for public rollout as soon as this week. We hear the Cyberspace Administration of China will soon give the green light to a handful of firms, and we're told that the search leader Baidu will be among the first to win approval for its AI models. The move does mark a milestone for China's AI industry, and it will allow the country to develop services capable of competing with the likes of Microsoft and Apple's, or should I say Alphabet's Google.
Well, we want to talk about what's happening in the U.S. banking complex today because federal regulators are ramping up demands for corrective action by some regional banks. The story from Bloomberg's Ann Cates.
The Federal Reserve has issued a slew of private warnings to lenders with assets of $100 billion to $250 billion, including Citizens Financial Group, Fifth Third, and M&T Bank. The wide-ranging notices have touched on everything from the financial institution's capital and liquidity to their technology and compliance. Examiners are looking for other signs of stress in the system already strained by the collapse of three banks, and it is part of a wider increase in scrutiny impacting lenders of all sizes. In Washington, Ann Cates, Bloomberg Daybreak Asia.
All right, let's have a look at what's been going on in Apple and in its manufacturing process and how it's perhaps changing how some of its devices are actually constructed or made. Here's Bloomberg's Tom Busby.
Apple is now testing out the use of 3D printers to make the steel casings for some of its soon-to-be-released smartwatches, a procedure that would reduce the time it takes to build some gadgets and use a lot less raw materials. Now, if the current work on Apple Watches goes according to plan, Apple could look to expand the process to even more devices in the next several years. An Apple spokesperson declined to comment. Tom Busby, Bloomberg Daybreak Asia.
After the closing bell here in the U.S., Salesforce gave a forecast for both revenue and profit for the current quarter above street estimates. The story now from Bloomberg's Charlie Pellet.
It signals progress in its campaign to cut costs following involvement by activist investors over the past year. Salesforce is the market leader in software that helps companies manage their customer relations. It has been narrowly focused on expanding its profit margins, a campaign that was hastened earlier this year by the emergence of multiple activist investors. In New York, Charlie Pellet, Bloomberg Daybreak Asia.
Well, I mentioned a little while back that another batch of economic numbers here in the U.S. points to moderation in the American economy. First, U.S. GDP revised lower for Q2, an annualized rate now of 2.1%. That adjustment does reflect more moderate business investment. And at the same time today, from ADP, the number of American companies adding jobs, well, fewer than forecast, the fewest in 5 months. On the positive side, we did have pending home sales unexpectedly move up. If you take a step back and look at the Citigroup Economic Surprise Index for the U.S., it extended its plunge below 50 after topping 80 earlier this month. Now, if you don't know, this is a measurement of the data that has been exceeding forecasts. So obviously now we've got a situation where fewer and fewer numbers are topping estimates. So on balance, everything that we're learning is helping to cement bets on the Fed being very, very near the end of its tightening cycle. Let's get to global news next. We've got an update on Hurricane Idalia, which made landfall today. Dan Schwartzman's here with that.
Yeah, it did, Doug. It's moved into southern Georgia after wreaking havoc in Florida. As of now, hundreds of thousands of Floridians are without power, with more than 1,800 flights grounded. Idalia coming ashore as a Category 3 hurricane. Its top winds now, though, are down to around 75 miles an hour. That's barely classified as a Category 1 hurricane. That's, of course, good news. President Biden says you can't deny the science on all these natural disasters.
I don't think anybody can deny the impact of the climate crisis anymore. Just look around. Historic floods, more intense droughts, extreme heat, significant wildfires have caused significant damage.
Parts of Florida experiencing flooding. Tampa and Clearwater seeing waters rise as much as 5 feet in some areas. Both Visa and MasterCard are looking to boost the fees that retailers pay when they accept credit and debit cards. Starting in October, online transactions using Visa will have higher fees. Commercial credit, debit, and prepaid card fees are slated to increase in April. Last year, U.S. merchants paid a record $160.7 billion in swipe fees. That's an increase of close to 17% from the year prior. The boost in fees is expected to add around $500 million more of costs to retailers. Both Senators Dick Durbin and Roger Marshall now urging both Visa and MasterCard to withdraw their plans to increase these fees. Both senators have introduced a bill that would enhance competition between credit card networks. Meanwhile, Visa and MasterCard shares rising to all-time highs after the announcement of the fee increases. U.S. officials say they have information that Russia and North Korea are negotiating arms deals. The White House says the North would give Russia munitions and other support for its invasion of Ukraine. The two sides are said to have exchanged letters looking to increase cooperation, with Russian officials having recently visited Pyongyang. The Biden administration has accused the Russian military and Wagner mercenary group of receiving deliveries of North Korean munitions. A federal judge has found Rudy Giuliani liable for defaming 2 Georgia election workers with voter fraud conspiracies. The former New York City mayor will next face a trial to see whether he will pay damages, and if so, how much. U.S. District Judge Beryl Howell also has ordered Giuliani to pay $132,000 to the victims for their legal fees. Giuliani's finances have been a prominent feature in the trial, with the judge saying he has till September 20th to turn over all financial information. The Trump ally says he will fight any damages and may appeal on the grounds his speech was constitutionally protected. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Dan Schwartzman. This is Bloomberg.
Let's bring in Anna Wong. She is Bloomberg chief U.S. economist. We're going to take a look at what's happening in the American economy. Anna joins us from our Washington, D.C. bureau, and I think she's on the phone today. Anna, thanks for being with us. Help me understand what's going on with the economy in light of the downward revision in GDP and a pretty soft number today from ADP.
Yeah, downward revision really is the theme of what's going on with U.S. statistics right now. So we saw today that GDP growth for the second quarter was revised down by 30 bips. And, recall that when the second quarter GDP came out, it exceeded expectations. But with this revisions, it basically means that, in fact, GDP growth was at or below expectations. ADP number, I wouldn't put too much, weight on it. However, it's still consistent with the themes that a lot of the growth activity data for the U.S. economy in real time was actually stronger than what, after all the revisions are done, is showing. So U.S. economy is weaker than it looks.
Yeah, and what about the JOLTS data? That was a bit weaker than anticipated, but it's still pretty strong, let's face it here. And I know that it's not that important, but it's getting more and more, so many more eyeballs looking at this.
Yeah, so, we were skeptical about the JOLTS data from last month because it showed a very tiny little drop, yet the more reliable indicators that indicate the temperature of the labor market are wages, and wages are falling much more sharply. So we had thought that maybe the labor market was cooling, much cooler than what JOLTS data show, and true enough, this week's JOLTS data did verify that, in fact, there were more decline in jobs opening than it seemed. And furthermore, I would also add that almost half of these jobs, 8.8 million jobs opening are by small to medium-sized businesses. And a lot of the jobs openings there are aspirational in our view, because small and medium enterprises in the U.S. have been facing a surge in bankruptcy rates. And I just don't think that a lot of those job openings are real.
So we're talking a lot about the evidence of economic softening or a little bit of weakness that is entering into the story. But I'm curious, Anna, to get your take on what that means for inflation, because tomorrow here in the States, we're going to get to the PCE number, and this is one of the Fed's favorites.
Right. And, yet tomorrow the PCE is likely to show that Powell's favorite indicator, which is the supercore or core services excluding housing, actually accelerated in July to 0.5%. That is really high. That is like more consistent with inflation at 5% than at 2%. So that is certainly discouraging. However, we argue that acceleration is driven singularly by a very volatile component, which is portfolio management category, which basically tells you nothing about true inflation. So the hope here is that the Fed does look through this high supercore number, as it is driven by a very volatile factor, and not put too much weight on it.
Of course, we got up to Friday, we got the non-farm payrolls report. But, even up till now, what's your take? Is the general feeling out there that the Fed is, they're done for this year, probably?
Yeah, I think right after Jackson Hole, more people were in the camp that the Fed still has one more hike in them, because Powell's speech just on the surface seems very hawkish. But our interpretation has always been that Powell is just steadily dovish. He talks about how real rates are, in fact, quite restrictive. And the thing is, we are seeing more significant cooling in the labor market. And certainly this week's data reinforce that subtly dovish message in Powell's Jackson Hole speech.
So if the labor market is softening, I wonder how that may translate into some of the consumer data we're getting tomorrow, which would include personal spending and income. Is there an expectation now that people are going to begin spending less, and maybe we see incomes starting to at least maybe remain steady?
Yeah, so on the income component, it's coming down, right? Because the labor market is softening and people have less bargaining power. So wage growth and income growth is coming down. Now, whether consumption will come down as well, that is what's interesting about the U.S. consumer, because the typical U.S. consumer keeps spending money that they don't have even. I think tomorrow's report is likely going to show that July spending was super robust. And that's partly because people are spending on Barbenheimer, on Taylor Swift concert, on Beyonce concert. And basically people are exhausting their financial resources. And I personally think that we are going to see a very weak Q4 consumption because people have overspent.
I think apparently, Anna, that we are looking at another $8.5 billion added to GDP in the third quarter. Really, because of Barbie Hammer and those other factors that you mentioned here. But are consumers spending after this, or was that spending that they brought forward in your view?
Well, I think if we did not have these four cultural phenomena, these consumers would not be spending, because they're spending at a time where delinquency rate on auto loans were spiking, on credit cards were spiking. These should be hunkering down. So I just think that the typical American consumer is not one that's gifted with foresight.
So I'm going to imagine then, based on what you're saying, that the light vehicle sales data that we're going to have on Friday is going to be soft as well.
Yes, that's my assumption, and that's driven by rising auto rates. The average interest rate on a used car is 13% now, and that's super high. And also, we are seeing surging rejection rate for auto loans applications, meaning it's harder for people to qualify for financing. Hence, this drop off in autos.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Asia, your morning brief on the stories making news from Hong Kong to Singapore and Wall Street.
Look for us on your podcast feed every day on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcast.
You can also listen live each day on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 106.1 in Boston, and Bloomberg 960 in San Francisco.
Our flagship New York station is available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, Sirius XM Channel 119, the iHeartRadio app, and on Bloomberg.com. I'm Doug Krisner.
And I'm Rashad Salamat. Join us again tomorrow for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Asia.